Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight at this first event of the three lecture series from the margin, Dante 701 years later. The series is brought to you through the generosity of the Siegfried B. and Elizabeth Mignon Pucknett Literary Studies Endowment, the Literature Department, the Humanities Institute, Cowell College, and the support of Italian Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz. As everybody knows, the first line of Dante's poem, the Commedia, is in the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark forest. In the middle of the journey of our life, at the heart of Dante's journey, there is therefore not only the poet's experience, but also our human experience and our time. And this is what we are here to explore tonight, the way in which Dante is still able to communicate to us today. Because 701 years after his death, it seems difficult to think of Dante as a traveling companion or someone who, through a personal journey made up of suffering, sacrifices, disappointment, and conversions, has completed a path of growth that he has decided to share with everyone. On the one hand, the incredible amount of events and celebration that have taken place in Italy and around the world last year are the incredible witness of Dante's legacy and the Commedia's legacy. But on the other hand, they can have the effect of the paradoxical effect of putting a distance between us and the man, the person behind the words of the poem. And this has often been the case in the celebration of Dante's comedy during the centuries, as part of the national myth in Italy, as a cultural artifact, the masterpiece of the Western literary canon. Dante and his poem were even exploited for the promotion of conflicting ideological discourses and political agendas. For me, the best testimony is always the example of Primo Levi, when in the periodic system, he remembers with a note of sarcasm the lines of the comedy that were quoted on the cover of the Defense of the Race, the fascist anti-Semitic propaganda organ, while he was in school. And even today, for many who belong to different cultures and religions, reading the comedy can coincide with an experience of exclusion and marginalization. Levi himself, however, shows us how a continuous personal exploration of the poem can transcend superficial and manipulative readings and ideological simplification. And in his case, it became a tool for recounting health and personal redemption, a means of emancipation in historical circumstances in which individuals or whole ethnic groups are persecuted to the point of physical elimination. During this event, this three lecture series, we would like to explore the less explored margins of this 700-year celebration. And that's why we decided to do a 701 years later celebration. And we will focus on some of the poem's many contributions to contemporary discussions about social and cultural struggles, like tonight. And we will also explore how Dante himself was very much a marginal intellectual who, throughout his experience in exile, discovered the marginalities around him. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us Dennis Looney, who served as director of the Office of Programs and director of the Association of Departments of Foreign Languages at the Modern Language Association, the MLA, from 2014 to 2021. Prior to that, from 1986 to 2013, he taught Italian at the University of Pittsburgh with secondary appointments in classics and philosophy. He was chair of the Department of French and Italian for 11 years and Assistant Dean of Humanities for 3 years at Pittsburgh. His books include Compromising the Classics, romance epic narrative in the Italian Renaissance with Wayne State in 1996, which received honorable mention from the MLA Scaglione Award in Italian Literary Studies, and Freedom Readers, The African American Reception of Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy, University of Notre Dame Press, 2011, which received also a prize from the American Association of Italian Studies. He co-edited and co-translated Ludovico Ariosto's Latin poetry for Harvard, and with D. Mark Posanza. Most recently, he received the James E. Alatis Founders Award for Lifetime Achievement in Advancing Language and International Education, Research and Development, and Practice through Advocacy. Tonight, Dennis come to us with a talk titled Reading Dante, Seeking Freedom, Fleeing Racism, which builds on the research and our latest developments of the research that brought him to write his book on the African American reception of Dante. So I thank you all for being here. I thank you, Dennis, for being here.
Thank you very much, Filippo. I'd like to formally thank Professor Filippo Gianferrari of the Department of Literature and the head of the Department of Literature, Carla Ferchero, for this warm welcome today. I also would like to thank Irina Polic, who's the managing director of the Humanities Institute, which is where I'm sitting, as well as the wonderfully helpful staff members, Alice Folkens and Diana Hogue. I'm so happy to be here in person in Santa Cruz. Those are redwoods behind me through the window. Face-to-face visits begin tomorrow. The campus has just reopened at the beginning of the month. And I'm also delighted and grateful to connect with so many of you out there in Zoom world, near and far. It's very thrilling for me to speak to you. I'm going to share my screen. And start with this image. Okay. I'd like to begin with this image of an art restorer working on a bust of Dante in the foyer at the entrance to the University Library in Bologna. As you can see, our poet is being carefully tended to. And maybe you'll agree with me, what a relief to see a mask and latex gloves being put to a different use than what the pandemic has accustomed us to. The message from the Biblioteca Universitaria di Bologna that accompanied this image refers to le operazioni di pulitura e restauro, the cleaning and conservation of the statue. I would like to use this image as a visual equivalent for my ongoing project of the reception of Dante, in which I hope to be presenting him, the poet and the man, as Filippo was just suggesting, in a new light. I'm striving, I hope, not to airbrush Dante with this renewed focus on how the engagement with Dante by American readers, Black and white, frequently seems to overlap with issues of social justice. I want to acknowledge up front the new perspectives on Dante coming to light in the recent work of scholars such as Akash Kumar, Christina Olson, Deborah Parker, and Guy Raffa. The reception of Dante, my focus in this talk, is an occasion to address questions of social justice that can point us to examine the topic of justice on a larger scale in Dante's own writing, which is part of work in progress that depends on what I'm sharing tonight. In Freedom Readers, I argue that Dante's critical fortune in the US is tied closely to the discourse of social justice through the entangled stories of our country's Black and white citizens. I examine the ways in which Dante has assumed a position of importance in African-American culture, literary and cinematic, exploring how African-Americans have read, interpreted, and responded to Dante and his work over approximately the last 2 centuries, from the late 1820s on what was then the American frontier to today. A first step in the project is to identify the wide range of imitations of Dante by artists of color in their respective historical contexts. Building on that work of identification, a goal of equal importance is to demonstrate how these imitators, in different ways and to varying degrees, excel in their response to the original medieval model. The final goal of the study is to suggest ways in which one might return to Dante's Divine Comedy with these African-American rewritings in mind in order to assess how they might affect our interpretation of it. To paraphrase this ultimate goal into a pair of guiding questions, what advantage do we derive from reconsidering Dante's work through the perspective provided by African-American culture? What does the reception of Dante tell us about African-American culture that we might not see otherwise? One of the gains from approaching Dante through this lens is in seeing how consistently the African-American tradition emphasizes issues of social justice in its response to Dante, to his work, especially to the Divine Comedy, and most often to the Inferno, but also to the man, the political man, who was exiled and who suffered for his political positions. How do African-American authors engage with Dante in a way that we might call political? I explore this ongoing reception through these chronological categories in separate case studies, what I call colored Dante, Negro Dante, Black Dante, and African-American Dante, these four different moments. I apply these designations with caution, aware that these terms, especially colored and Negro, when used as adjectives, even as historical markers, have often been intended to belittle the product of such a combination. Is a Negro Dante, for example, some sort of lesser version of the original and therefore not quite as good? The works I examine in the larger study suggest otherwise. Leaping in the opening chapter of her Domestic Manners of the Americans, Frances Trollope, mother of the novelist Anthony Trollope, alludes to Dante's Inferno to describe her arrival in the United States at the mouth of the Mississippi River on Christmas Day, 1827, after a 7-week voyage from London. I never beheld a scene so utterly desolate as this entrance of the Mississippi. Had Dante seen it, he might have drawn images of another Bolgia from its horrors. One only object rears itself above the eddying waters. This is the mast of a vessel long since wrecked in attempting to cross the bar, and it still stands a dismal witness of the destruction that has been and a boding prophet of that which is to come. Trollope was on her way to Nashoba, a pioneering interracial utopia in the dense forests of Western Tennessee. You can see Memphis here. So we come up the Mississippi. Here's Memphis, and here's Nashoba, about 15 miles inland. Nashoba was dedicated to gradual emancipation through cooperative working arrangements and the education of freed former enslaved persons. The community was established in 1825 by one of Trollope's acquaintances from England, the free-spirited abolitionist and later important suffragette voice, Frances Wright. I like this image of Frances Wright, pensive image of Frances Wright with quill pens on the desk and with a scroll in her hand. She, post 1825, up to her death in 1852, I think, toured the US wide and far and near, giving talks about abolitionism and women's rights as well. Trollope and the 3 children traveling with her arrived in Nashoba to their great dismay. Her friend was there, Frances Wright, but this is sort of what she saw. The colony was undeveloped, few settlers, no school yet, inadequate housing, poor food, and all this in a rough setting with a bad climate, at least in January. Trollope depicts Nashoba, without relying precisely on Dante, in much the same terms of desolation with which she had described the Delta. The forest became thicker and more dreary looking every mile. We advanced, but our evergreening Negro declared it was a right good road and that we should be sure to get to Nashoba, and so we did. One glance sufficed to convince me that every idea I had formed of the place was as far as possible from the truth. Desolation was the only feeling, the only word that presented itself. Trollope only lasted 10 days. her comment about the evergreen Negro, and again, those are my italics up there on the text, the evergreen Negro and her mocking imitation of his idiom, his right good road, suggests that maybe she wasn't as ready for interracial cooperative living as she had imagined. She quickly made plans to do something different. She left the utopia on the grounds that the malarial waters surrounding the settlement endangered the health of her children. Trollope sailed up the Mississippi and then up the Ohio to Cincinnati, the new boomtown of what was then called Western America, arriving there on February 10th, 1828. There, together with a young artist who would go on to become a very important American sculptor, first based in Washington and then in Florence, Italy. In 1828, she, with Hiram Powers, created a wax museum inspired by Dante's Inferno. Here's a poster for the museum that was published in a Cincinnati newspaper. The Inferno is interesting in and of itself, but it featured the unusual and attention-getting representation of a Black man in hell alongside white sinners, a spectacular sight that caught the attention of many visitors. So here was an ad that accompanied that poster. The proprietor of the Western Museum, it was kind of an anthropological museum, we might say, with artifacts. It had a woolly mammoth tooth, supposedly, and some Native American things. The Western Museum, always anxious to oblige his subscribers, the proprietor, and the public, to make his museum as attractive as possible to the public, begs to announce that in the future, when you come to the museum, you will also get to go see a splendid exhibition of Dante's Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise without additional charge. And then one of her other children, not the famous novelist Thomas Trollope, not Anthony, writes in his memoirs the following about how this was created. It occurred to my mother to suggest to Hiram Powers to get up a representation of one of Dante's Volgas as described in the Inferno. The nascent sculptor with his imaginative brain, artistic eye, and clever fingers caught at the idea on the instant, and forthwith they set to work, my mother explaining the poet's conceptions, suggesting the composition of the tableaus, supplying details, while Powers designed and executed the figures and the necessary mise-en-scène, and he also electrified some of the mise-en-scène so that if you touched gates and various things, you would get a slight shock. Many people go to this and write about it, take note of it. Importantly, for my project, a Quaker, in a Quaker magazine, publishes this review of a detailed description of it. And I should say none of these, the Wax Museum was taken in part to New York City in 1841, where it was burned inadvertently. It got caught in fire. And so we don't have any of the figures left. The Quaker reporter says, on the right hand of the devil above described and on the left of the spectator is seen one department of this hell, which is the hell of ice, a most heretical place. And then at the bottom of the paragraph, but what added much to the effect of this freezing bottom of hell, the ninth circle, was the condition of a poor old Negro just entering upon a state of perpetual freezing. Sad predicament, truly, for one so constitutionally fond of a warm climate. Why Dante, and why an integrated hell? What might the micro-history of this wax museum have to do with social justice and Dante's poem and our reading of it? The Pilgrim's Passage from Hell to Heaven, it turns out, like the narrative of the children of Israel fleeing Egypt in search of the promised land, was of heightened interest to a people with an experience and then later a memory of slavery. Moreover, Dante, the historical man, in addition to the character in the Divine Comedy, had become an important symbol of freedom for many of the Anglo-American abolitionists, some of whom maintained close ties to the New Italy, La Giovane Italia, during the period of the Risorgimento, from the 1840s to the foundation of the unified Italian state in the 1860s and 70s. Many of the New England intellectual elite who promoted the study of Dante's life and works, Emerson, Lowell, Norton, Margaret Fuller, and Longfellow first among them, were also closely connected with the abolitionists. As were many politicians around the time of the Civil War, who also used Dante in making a case for their chosen position. In 1856, this man, Charles Sumner, invoked Dante's depiction of the cowardly neutrals in Inferno 3 when urging his fellow senators to take a stand against admitting Kansas and Nebraska to the Union as states that would allow slavery. Here's Sumner again. Oops, can we? I'm not sure if you can see the tops of the pictures. I can't. Sorry about that. Well, you can see the part that I want you to see, I suppose, all too well. This is from January 6, 2021. This is one of the insurrectionists in the Capitol not too long ago, and carrying on his shoulder the rebel flag. He's walking in front of a painting above that sofa of Charles Sumner. And so to his right is Charles Sumner. To his left is a painting of John C. Calhoun, who was doing everything he could do in the 1830s and 40s to promote secessionism, secession from the Union. So creating the context in which eventually we would go to a civil war in the United States. And I should say that this has been written about very eloquently by Christina Olson, whose name I mentioned earlier in an important statement about what happened on January 6, 2021 and its connections to Dante. My point is Dante's being used by abolitionists, one of whom was insulted, we could say, in this latest moment of insurrection. Less well known and the Sumner story is fairly well known. Less well known is that William Henry Seward, the main challenger to Lincoln's presidential campaign in 1860, you see him sitting here in front of the table, who was then brought into the team of rivals that made up Lincoln's cabinet as Secretary of State, had a life-size painting of Dante and Virgil in conversation with Ulysses from Inferno, Canto 26, in his dining room. And here it is. It's still there in the family home, now a museum in Auburn, New York. Seward's was a family of readers that had at least 2 copies of Dante's poem in its collection, the 1845 printing of Carey's translation with Flaxman's drawings, and an undated copy of Carey's translation with the Doré illustrations. Seward and his wife, Frances, were unwavering abolitionists who supported aggressively Harriet Tubman, among others, sold her property, and she built her house down the road from their house. Ulysses, in this image, is a reminder, I assume, of the dangers of false counsel for Seward as a politician who is taking up the case of abolitionism. Ulysses in Inferno 26 is punished for being a fraudulent or false counselor in Dante's version of his story. Those are just 2 other examples of politicians in the time around the Civil War whose work and lives overlapped with African-American cultural experiences and traditions. There's a story in Italy that this American history overlaps with as well. Italian nationalists who argued that their compatriots were enslaved to the Austrians in the north, the Spanish Bourbons in the south, and to the Vatican throughout the middle of the peninsula, promoted Dante's unflinching criticism of the papacy in an attempt to convince their contemporaries to struggle for self-rule and determination. Giuseppe Mazzini made this case forcefully in the middle decades of the 19th century, and it was none other than William Lloyd Garrison, the most important American abolitionist, who edited Mazzini's writings for readers of English in 1872. Mazzini's political Dante is handed on to Garrison and through him to readers on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's out of this kind of heady mix, political mix, Cordelia Ray, my best example of an African-American author who writes what I call a colored Dante, who's depicted here on the left with her text in front of her appropriately. And Charles Bennett, whose father, Charles Bennett Ray, on the right, was an associate of Frederick Douglass. She, Cordelia, turns the medieval Italian poet into a constitutional activist lawyer, an abolitionist, we might say, in her charged 52-line poem, Dante, published in 1885. And William Wells Brown, author of the first African-American novel, Clotel, represents Dante in a similarly politicized way over 4 versions of the novel published between 1853 and 1867, Clotel, or the President's Daughter, a narrative of slave life. This is the novel that outed Thomas Jefferson for his relationship with Sally Hemings. You can see that it was published not in the US, published in London. When a member of the press visited the elderly Frederick Douglass at home in 1889, just after the final version of his autobiography had come out, he said, and now I'm quoting, "Mr. Douglass invited the reporter into his library," so he says in the third person, "into his library, and there the faces of the late Chief Justice Chase, William Lloyd Garrison, Dante, Abraham Lincoln, John Brown, and Charles Sumner looked down in smiles and respect on the great Negro sage." Washington Press, 1889. By the 80s and 90s of the 19th century, Dante had become a fixture in the politics of the liberal world on a par with none less than Abraham Lincoln. Before I move from this 19th century colored Dante to Negro Dante at the beginnings of the 20th century, I want to pause and look briefly at some other readers of the poet in the second half of the 19th century that I've gotten interested in lately. Though not readers of color, these people were intimately connected to the fate of African Americans, none less than Verena Howell Davis, that would be Mrs. Jefferson Davis, the First Lady of the Confederacy, displays a fairly good awareness of Dante in more than one place in her works that I've explored thus far. But it is Augusta Evans Wilson, the most popular Southern author of the 19th century, whose dependence on Dante is most striking. Her third novel, Macaria, or Altars of Sacrifice, published in 1864, is dedicated to the soldiers of the Confederate Army. It recounts the intertwined tale of 2 white women, one upper class, one working class, using Dante's Purgatory in key moments as a text with a message of resilience and resistance for the women, the white women of the South. An officer for the occupying Northern Army in Nashville, Tennessee, during the war, banned Macaria from his troops. It was apparently very popular, worrying that it was bad for morale. Her next novel, St. Elmo, published in 1866, is calculated by literary historians to be the most published book after the Bible and Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 19th century. This is a later dust jacket, but the image is appropriate because it shows the protagonist swamped in texts with different kinds of text, books, manuscripts. There's a writing implement in her hand all around while the man in her life is trying to figure out what's going on. The novel's narrative revolves around the relationship that develops when a young woman finds a copy of the Divine Comedy, it happens to be the Carrie Flaxman edition, on the ground in front of her grandfather's blacksmith shop. She eventually restores it to its owner, who's looking in through the doorway, St. Elmo Murray, for whom the novel is named, whom she, Edna Earle, the protagonist's name, is able, over the course of the long novel, to eventually civilize. But civilizing that guy peeking in the doorway doesn't make him into a reconstructionist who in the 1860s and 70s accepts the defeat of the South and goes forward. Wilson's Augusta Evans's pro-Southern position ignores that political abolitionist Dante. It's a different Dante, but it's an interesting Dante to me. It's a restorative Dante. It's a kind of self-help Dante. It's a purgatorial Dante who's very interested in providing a model of resistance and resilience for certain of the readers. Now I'm going to take a leap into the 20th century and move forward from this, what I've been calling moment of color Dante, to Negro Dante, through this figure here, Spencer Williams, who is famously or infamously Andy in the TV radio show Amos and Andy. Spencer Williams provides one of my examples of a Negro Dante. He was an independent filmmaker who worked in the 20s, from the 20s into the 50s, 1920s to 1950s. He uses Dante's allegory of good and evil to shed light on the daily existence of the Negro's segregated world in the first half of the 20th century. Williams splices cuts from the first feature-length film in Italian cinematic history, the silent movie L'Inferno, which was created in 1911. He slices those cuts from that film into his own Go Down Death from 1944. And in so doing, uses Dante, the character in the film, to integrate his all-Negro production. At about this same time, Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison engaged Dante in their desire to change Negro America too. Here's some of the stills from the silent film that Williams splices into his own film, where his character gets a vision of hell. In this same moment, really at the end of this 50-year period from 1900 to 1950, in the late 40s, this man, Ralph Ellison, takes up Dante. So I'd like to focus on him for a moment. A note, here he is, I like this photograph with his paper in hand, his pencil, pausing in front of his own texts and things that he's working from. A note found in the Ellison archives in the Library of Congress takes us inside his head and sheds light on Dante's influence on him. An 8x11 sheet divided into two columns. The column on the left consists of 14 nouns. It's written in ink and dashed off hurriedly, as is often his wont. Most of the words are spelled out in capital letters, which make them sound proclamatory, as if they were being declared. To the right and at the center of the page is an abbreviated list, a sort of heading, which announces what the column to the left is really about: crime and expiation. Beneath this pair is the only phrase in the note, a tag in slang, going to end of line. And you can see ice, fire, rot, and down at the bottom of the first column, migration, lostness, submergence, silence. The longer column on the left contains the features of an infernal topography of the sort that Dante imagines in the Inferno. In fact, every single word could be said to have a correspondent in Dante's depiction of hell. And there are terms like exile and migration, which have special significance to Black Americans of Ellison's generation and the generation before, many of whom felt exiled from American democracy and participated in the Great Migration from the rural South to the industrial Midwest and North. The unexpected occurrence of the term exile emphasizes that migration is being recast as infernal too. Migration north becomes almost a form of punishment for the simple fact of being Black in the segregated South. Both Richard Wright and Ellison will interpret the Great Migration in Dantesque terms. This note is one of several that suggests parallels between his great novel, Invisible Man, and Dante's Inferno. Critics have pointed out thematic and structural parallels. Invisible Man, for example, lives in a man-made cave under the streets of Harlem, as well as those passages where there are direct allusions to Dante, the first and most obvious of which is this reference to jazz in the prologue. I not only entered the music, Louis Armstrong, but descended like Dante into its depths. This allusion from the opening of the novel announces an allegiance to Dante. It's the first European author mentioned in the novel, and to what Dante represents, and raises the question of what Dante's presence in the text reveals of Ellison's thinking about justice and European literature for that matter. Here's Ellison slightly later. In 1956 and 7, he spent 2 years at the American Academy in Rome. So he's outside here, he's got his typewriter there. He's moved to a different kind of writing instrument, and he loves to tinker with his typewriter. And he loves to produce typed manuscripts that he then works on in writing. Here's the beginning of Invisible Man. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe. And then if you go deeper into the prologue of the opening of Invisible Man, you see at the bottom of this typescript I not only question mark the muse, but descended like question mark into the depths. This is a preliminary draft, and the underlined text in the final printed prologue is in italics as he goes into a kind of reverie, smoking marijuana, sort of blisses out. But right before he blisses out, I not only something the muse. As we go deeper into the archive and find copies that he's writing on, we find I not only entered the music, but descended like Dante into its depths. And here's a clean version of that script. I not only entered the music, but descended like Dante into its depths, which is what he sent off to the press for the final publication. As he readies the final typescript for submission to the press, he leaves the sentence with the reference to Dante alone from this point on. Dante replaces that question mark. Dante fills that gap. And once Dante entered Ellison's text, he stayed there. He becomes one of Ellison's main guides to the questions of justice throughout the novel. I'm moving forward kind of swiftly into the second half of the 20th century, from colored Dante to Negro Dante and now to Black Dante in this chronology of Dante's reception, to this text and this man. During the Black Revolution, Dante retains his potential as a powerful model of emancipation, exemplified by Leroy Jones, who uses the medieval poet as a model for a modern slave narrative, making himself out to be a Black Dante. In the System of Dante's Hell, published in another anniversary year, we've just come through 2021, which was celebrating the 700th year of Dante's death. We're in 701 now, as Filippo said. In another anniversary year, 1965, Leroy Jones publishes this. It is an obsessed text with the structural system of Dante's moral cosmos, as the title makes clear, and he uses it to write, to hang his autobiography on, and to write about social injustice in segregated 1940s and 50s America. Writing about Dante liberates Leroy Jones. It turns him into a new man, and in fact, here he is on the back of the novel. That's Leroy Jones. Here he is a couple of years later. He's a new man with a new name and a new look and a new attitude. Amiri Baraka, who becomes then a model for hip hop poets of the urban inner city in the next text that I want to turn to. But before I do that, here's a portrait of Amiri Baraka at the end of his life, the griot. He had become the poet laureate of New Jersey. There are various other things one could say about him, never relinquishing this interest in Dante. Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, is a model for the hip hop poets that are in the novel by Gloria Naylor, Linden Hills. These are two poets who live in the urban inner city in Naylor's novel. The African-American artist she creates, and now really moved to 1986. We're moving into the final part of this trajectory, African-American Dante. The African-American artists she creates follow in Dante's footsteps, although they are very wary of writing for its potential to enslave them, they say, opting instead for a new oral tradition, hip hop, which takes its inspiration in part from Dante's poem. Naylor uses Dante in great detail. His extraordinary imitation in terms of works of art is probably the most completed and best imitation of Dante in all these pieces. Naylor uses Dante to explore how the intersection of race, class, and sexuality complicates the African-American middle class's rise in the 1980s. Where is justice, she asks, if this color, the skin color of a baby, no less, determines everything in one's life? I want to pivot toward a conclusion with a glimpse at how Naylor comments on social justice and education using Dante's portrayal of the gates of hell. But I want to do this by way of two other sets of images of those same gates, one by Domenico di Michelino and another by Thomas Nast. More on him in just a second. So this is a painting that I'm sure some of you have seen. It's housed in the big church in Florence, the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence, which you see represented here. This is Dante. This is painted in yet another anniversary year, 1465, 200 years after Dante's birth. It was originally commissioned by the Medici family, and it was originally housed in the Medici Palace up the street from the Duomo inside the city of Florence. It's an attempt by the Medici family and the Medici cultural establishment to recover or recuperate, to bring back Dante into Florentine and Tuscan culture, because the Florentines in 1301 had exiled Dante. Appropriately, this painting shows him outside the Florentine city gates, which are here. He's in the middle of this landscape. Here's Florence on one side, and I should just say in parentheses, it's an anachronistic portrait of Florence from Dante's perspective. It's Florence in 1465, not Florence in 1301. It's Florence of the painter's moment, but several of these images that you see, the Bargello and the Badia, for example, are parts of Dante's Florence. So it's an interesting amalgam of past and present. And here's Dante. Dante is outside the city gates. He's standing with his book in hand, opened to, this is the Divine Comedy, open to the first lines of the Inferno, nel mezzo del cammino nostra vita. In a better reproduction, you would see, or in person, you can see the text is radiating golden rays. Dante's wearing the laurel crown as a symbol for his poetic excellence, but as we know from reading the poem, he wished that that might happen, but it never happened. So this is, again, a kind of wishful thinking of how Dante should be seen. He's gesturing with his right hand to another set of gates, the gates of hell, right here, that he writes about in the Inferno. And these are figures from Dante's Inferno. And then behind him is purgatory, and above is heaven, paradise. And here's another set of gates, the gates of heaven, we might say, that is the gates through which souls, here they're lining up, progress. And once they're on the island of purgatory, they're going, assuming they make it through their purgation, they're on their way to being saints in heaven. So interesting positioning of Dante among the figure here, Dante, among the city gates, the gates of hell, the gates to heaven. On those gates of hell, one sees these famous lines, per me si va nella città dolente, in Dante's text. And it's a tour de force. Those of you who've read it will remember how striking it is. You open the poem to the third canto, you turn the page, and the gates of hell speak. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente, down to the famous last line of these three terces, lasciate ogni speranza, voi che entrate. Dante, the character, says to Virgil, I don't really understand what's being said here. Can you explain it to me? And Virgil then does. It's a spectacular, as I say, a poetic tour de force. The gates themselves seem to be talking as Dante, the character, reads that text. Gloria Naylor does interesting things with this, but before I come to her, let me tell you about Thomas Nast, another 19th century figure that I'm intrigued by. With the onset of mass immigration and a growing Italian presence in the United States at the end of the 19th century, Dante takes on new meanings. As immigrants from Italy streamed into the United States, a great many of them passed through the harbor of New York City, where the Statue of Liberty, as you see here, greeted them with her famous welcome. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. Those lines, taken from a poem by Emma Lazarus, were composed in 1883 as part of a campaign to raise money for the construction of the statue's pedestal. Eventually, they were inscribed on a plaque inside that pedestal in 1903. The poem effectively transformed that neoclassical symbol of Republican liberty that the government of France had given to the government, that the people of France had given to the people of the United States of America. It transformed that neoclassical symbol of Republican liberty into an image of the immigrants' newfound freedom in the land of opportunity. After landing, however, immigrants entered holding rooms, first at Castle Garden and then later at Ellis Island, where they began dealing with their new state's bureaucracy. They quickly discovered that the streets of America were not paved with gold. And I don't need to remind you of what's happening at the border to the south of us over the past couple of years. In 1881, the cartoonist Thomas Nast sought to warn immigrants about the perils of life in their new country with a striking adaptation of the Statue of Liberty, which was then in 1881 under construction, which appeared in Harper's Weekly. The cartoon provides visual commentary to an editorial column about New Yorkers' growing protests, not against immigrants, but against the unsanitary quality of life in their city. The city was not healthy, either for its inhabitants or for the new immigrants who were contracting illnesses as they came through, either on passage to the new country, and they were growing more ill in holding areas as they waited to gain entrance to the US. Nast's image takes Lady Liberty and transforms her into a skeletal figure of death with a roll of death in her left hand in the place of the Declaration of Independence and under her left arm, and the lamp of liberty turned upside down in the other. And then an inscription on the base of the pedestal that proclaims, New York, leave all hope, ye that enter here, as it were. The allusion to the gates of hell in Dante's Inferno takes that famous last verse of the nine lines on Dante's own gates of hell, lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, and contextualizes it for this description. We're coming back to Gloria Naylor, who takes those same lines and puts them in an interesting place. I'll read the pertinent passage from her novel here. Her two main characters are Willie and Lester. Lester is nicknamed Shit. Lester is whiter than Willie, and Willie calls him Shit in reference to his color, part of the repartee and the thematic conversations that are taking place between the lines, as it were. They, the two characters, walked along the front of the school and past the main entrance. There were 3 bronze plaques over the triple doors. I am the way out of the city of woe. I am the way to a prosperous people. I am the way from eternal sorrow. Chico and the Raiders had spray painted their insignia over the middle plaque. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. You know, Shit, Willie said, looking up at the last bronze plaque. Only the elements time cannot wear were made before me, and beyond time I stand, abandon ignorance, ye who enter here. I could have done all right if I'd gone to school. End quote. The translation of Inferno 3 lines 1 to 9 that form the text for these 3 plaques over the doors of the school that is on the edge of the ghetto on the road that leads up to Linden Hills, which is the new middle-class development. Though that translation comes from John Chardy's popular version, completed in 1954 and reprinted frequently thereafter, a staple translation used in great books courses in the 1960s and 1970s. Naylor makes, you heard it I'm sure, several crucial changes to Chardy's version to shift the meaning of the inscription from that of entering hell to that of escaping an inferno of economic and social disadvantage through education. In the first line on the first plaque, into the city of woe becomes out of. In the next line, forsaken is changed to prosperous people. Forsaken people becomes prosperous people. The final line of the verse changes into to from. In the third, the most telling alteration of all is in that last line of the passage. Dante's famous verse, probably the best known verse in the entire Divine Comedy, abandon all hope, ye who enter here, becomes abandon ignorance, ye who enter here. The message is clear. Education is the way out of a desperate life. More ambiguous is the suggestion that passing through the doors gives the student the means to move up to a better social class, to move from a forsaken people, Dante's hopeless sinners, to a prosperous people, the nouveau riche of the Linden Hills development. That new prosperity, readers of the novel learn, comes at a high cost. Naylor's depiction of the gates of hell features different kinds of writing, each an intriguing example of written culture. The bronze plaques over each door are set off in her text as indented quotations with a single tercet marking each plaque. The juxtaposition of stamped lettering in bronze and graffiti over that second door is a visual recreation of standard and vernacular modes of expression, regular speech and dialect. Both modes are treated equally in the passage. The narrator reads the first plaque and then observes the graffiti that covers the second plaque without adding any disparaging remarks about the gang's signature, and then moves on to read the third. In fact, Naylor's own authorial intervention on the texts of the first and third plaques parallels Chico's defacement of the second plaque, we might say. She does to Dante what he does to Dante. More than juxtaposing modes of expression, the image of the bronze plaque covered with graffiti brings two cultures together. One European, learned and monumental, but in danger of falling out of touch and out of date in this context. The other African-American, less tutored and angry, knowledgeable about the world in a different way, agitating to eclipse the primary culture. Naylor is equally a part of both, for the author is engaged in a literary project that is analogous to what she portrays on the front of the school. Her work is clearly in the Anglo-American tradition of the novel, and by extension, at least one critic has observed, in the tradition of classical epic. The development of character, plot, voice, and narrative in Linden Hills is recognizable to readers schooled in the genre of the novel. At the same time, Naylor adapts that European literary form to do justice to the African-American material she embraces and has at hand, and to appeal to as wide an audience as possible. Other rhetorical traditions surface throughout the narrative of Linden Hills, several of which are integral parts of the African-American rhetorical experience. The preaching of the church is one. The speeches of Malcolm X is another. These help to define the literariness of Naylor's writing in this novel, as does the more confidential rhetoric of women's diaries, of their recipe books, and of their letters. Naylor maintains the balance between the high culture of the novel and the different cultures of these other literary forms through her imitation of Dante. To be sure, it's Dante's text over the doors of the school that advertises the way out of hopelessness and positions itself to be perceived as the vehicle of high culture. But Naylor has no qualms about visiting her own changes upon that text. Her Dante does not belong to a monolithic realm of unchangeable culture. It's not medieval Catholic sempiternal. Her Dante is a figure in that tradition to which writers of color have had recourse from the second half of the 19th century to today as a powerful compromise between European cultural traditions, political and literary, and other cultural traditions that are equally parts of the African-American experience. And Naylor, like the other authors and artists of color I've mentioned in this presentation, uses her respective version of Dante to push all of us who read her book and make us think about all the other books that I've talked about to keep trying to form a more just union. In that way, her imitation of Dante provides an appropriate conclusion, I hope, to this survey of how the African-American tradition has repeatedly turned to and continues to turn to Dante to make a case for justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. This was a very, as some of our of the participants have already highlighted, this was a really rich presentation that made us learn a lot we didn't know about American history, not just about Dante, of course. I'm sorry, I'm a very bad moderator. I don't have much experience, so I forgot to mention that you are very welcome to write all your question in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them to Dennis. So as your questions pour in the Q&A chat, I will break the ice by asking the first question that, as a dentist, came to mind right away. You mostly quoted examples from receptions of the Inferno. And since this is a conversation we have had with the students in my class lately, I wanted to ask right away, are there instances of reception of also, you mentioned you mentioned purgatory at one point, but I was wondering if, it's mostly the Inferno. It's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, do you see more the sign of reception of the Inferno already mediated by, popular culture or the kind of great book tradition in which the comedies read, or do you see more like kind of in-depth personal kind of reading of the Inferno? So this would be my first kind of general question.
Thank you. Let me take the first question that you posed, Inferno versus Purgatory. I don't find in the African-American tradition many examples of references to purgatory, but I encourage everybody out in the audience to go find them and then share them with me. I'm sure they're out there. Amiri Baraka does a wonderful thing where he's writing a kind of Ezra Poundian autobiographical novel, and he likes to, in the way that Pound did, make obscure references. This is a hypermodernist, make obscure references that send the readers scurrying to try to figure out what on earth he's talking about. And apparently at one point Pound joked about that. Baraka joked about it too. He actually makes reference to purgatory, Dante's Purgatory, but it's a bogus reference. And I'm sure he did it to have fun with the reader and with himself. He's talking about the system of Dante's hell, and all of a sudden, I can't reconstruct the exact quote, but I talk about it in Freedom Readers at one point. But he's playing around when he does that. I was interested, and this is part of my ongoing project. I haven't been upfront in saying to the world what it is exactly I'm doing, but maybe now's a good time. I think maybe I'm writing a second book on all this that becomes like a bookend that I thought would start out being non-African-American writers thinking about race using Dante. And my first example, some people will know this essay, it's just come out in the last year, is on Alan Tate, a Southern poet who writes what he considers to be his best poem. It's certainly a very powerful poem called The Swimmers in Terza Rima, about a lynching that he witnessed the end of in 1911 as a kid in rural Kentucky. And Alan Tate, once upon a time was, a viewed as a great American poet. I think now people wouldn't say that quite, but John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, Robert Penn Warren, and some other figures are critical readers of Dante in the South in the 1920s and 30s. They're inspired by T.S. Eliot, but they're at their best when they're not channeling T.S. Eliot. I just want to come out and say, and especially Robert Penn Warren. So it's exploring that has sent me to look at other things in the Southern literary tradition. And who knew? I didn't even know the name Augusta Jane Evans, who then married a man named Wilson. So sometimes you see her name as Augusta Wilson, Augusta Evans Wilson. Who knew there was this author? And I'm not saying she's a great author, but her novel, St. Elmo, was so popular, as I pointed out, that I don't know if this is a measure of popularity, but that Eudora Welty names a character in one of her novels after the protagonist in St. Elmo, Edna Earl. So, if you're in the South, if you're in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and you're living in the 19th century, and you're reading Augusta Evans Wilson, and Augusta Evans Wilson is reading Dante, so her best novel is all about Dante. And the Dante that she's interested in, and that's the point that I was kind of squeezing in here earlier, is a Dante of Purgatory. And that fascinates me. So in the 1850s and 60s, I don't want to generalize, but I think I can generalize. In the 1850s and 60s, Southern female readers are interested in Dante, and I found some examples, and they're much more interested in purgatory than hell. They got enough hell in front of them, and purgatory seems to offer hope. And Robert Penn Warren, too, is the most, I guess, I don't want to abuse the word sensitive. I'd like to find a better word to describe him. He's the most tolerant and open-minded of all those Southern writers that I mentioned. And he goes from writing something in 1930 that is making an argument for humane segregation. He turns his back on all of that and in the 1950s and 60s writes a couple of very important works. One is called Segregation, and it is arguing against segregation, and another is called Who Speaks for the Negro, and it's arguing for giving people of color a voice. And then he writes another one about the legacy of the Civil War that is maybe equally important. So he writes these important prose essays. He too turns to purgatory. So I think I don't know exactly how to articulate this artfully yet, and I didn't do it tonight, but Southern white readers use Dante to help them figure out race to some extent. And that Dante that they turn to is purgatorial because it gives them some hope. And so in All the King's Men, the great novel by Robert Penn Warren, for which he got the Pulitzer Prize, which was made into a movie in 1948 or 9 that won the Academy Awards as best film and has been remade with Sean Penn and some other good actors. In 2006, Robert Penn Warren's novel All the King's Men opens with an epigraph to purgatory, and it's the epigraph from the Manfredi, Sempre che la speranza a fior del verde. As long as there's hope keeps things, as long as there is some hopefulness, is one way to try to paraphrase that line. One has a right to be hopeful at the beginning of Purgatory, and Robert Penn Warren uses that Dante. So Inferno versus Purgatory, it may be an interesting juxtaposition to see that one set of readers, African Americans, use Inferno, and another set of readers thinking about the same problems use Purgatory, but I'm not quite ready to say that. As far as your second question, sorry, that was a long, sounded like a commercial, self-promotion. Inferno mediated by African-American authors, African-American culture, like non-African-American culture, is very interested in visual Dante. And so those illustrated editions, Flaxman and Doré, are very important, and numerous African-American readers make reference to Doré. And for that matter, the film clips that you saw in the couple of slides that I showed from Go Down Death, that are taken from the 1911 L'Inferno, are film clips that themselves are inspired by Doré's illustrations. And so the Italian filmmakers in 1911 have Doré open, and they're trying to do a movie in pictures, but they're doing, the pictures that they are moving are Doré's. So the Inferno, the experience of the Inferno is mediated very much by visual popular culture. And that is something that people have worked on, but one could work on it even more. And I would just say again, shout out to Hiram Powers in 1828 for electrifying his wax museum. And that's the first example in this tradition of several things, but one is of popularizing, taking Dante to the people. So thank you for that opening question.
Yeah, and I have way more questions and also follow-up one, but I want to make sure we go over the very interesting questions that have been asked. So Let's start with this one because I think it's more related to your own presentation and kind of ask clarification. And then there are very interesting questions that are more on also on the side of more recent reception. So pro-slavery thinkers often use the Bible to support their arguments. Was Dante dragged into this side of the debates around African American, or was he only drawn on by the freedom?
Can you say the first word again? What kind of readers?
Pro-slavery thinkers often use the Bible
right.
to support. Yeah. So was he ever? Are there instances of Dante being dragged on the other side of the debate?
I haven't found that. I would be intrigued to see that. When I got into these Southern women writers, well, especially Augusta Evans, as I say, she's not trying to use, I don't see examples of her using Dante to make a case for slavery, even though she's unreconstructed, as they say. She's totally upset that the South loses. So the answer is no, but I want to qualify and say, there's a lot of stuff out there that I haven't looked at, to put it mildly, and one can go explore it. I was shocked, but nothing should shock us anymore, when I read that Verena Davis, so again, that's Mrs. Jefferson Davis, who married her husband when she was 17, he was 35. He'd already been through one marriage that ended in death of his wife. He was depressed and had lots of other problems. Verena Davis is at a party in Washington, D.C. Well, he becomes a senator. They move from Mississippi to Washington. But before I tell you that, let me tell you, her father is from New Jersey. She famously referred to herself as not a Southerner, but a half-breed. So she wasn't comfortable in Mississippi, it turns out. She was educated in in Philadelphia. So there were many things about Jefferson Davis's second wife, the First Lady of the Confederacy, that could give one pause. She wasn't a Southern belle. She was dark, she was swarthy, she didn't look the way she was supposed to look. And so that's all very interesting about her. There she is at a party in Washington, D.C., and she can hold her own in a conversation about Dante with the men in the room. And this gets referred to. And there are other instances in her life where she herself refers to Dante. And at the end of his life, when her husband finally dies in 1889, she immediately leaves Mobile, Alabama, and goes to New York City and becomes a journalist. And so someone else can go do this, but I want to go read her journalism and see what's in that about Dante. And she writes for Pulitzer, the guy whose name adorns the Pulitzer Prize. She writes for Pulitzer's New York newspaper, which I think was called the New York Daily or the New York World. And she has a regular column. She's on a retainer. She gets X amount of money a year, and she writes stuff. And so I think she's got 70 columns, and I am eager to go dig in those. But I haven't found anyone who uses, I mentioned her as an example of someone who's intriguing me. I haven't found anyone who's using Dante to make a case for slavery. I would love to see that.
Or maybe not. Anyway,
I would love to see it. I mean,
I just
no, but it's interesting that the Bible, as the questioner points out, the Bible gets used and abused. And one definition of a classical text, I think this may be Calvino's definition of a classic, is that you find in it what you need to find. Right. So people find in the Bible what they need to find. I want my classical text to be a little bit more sempiternal. I'm a little bit more old-fashioned, but I realize we find in them what we need to find. The interesting thing is that we keep turning to them. But please, I invite the audience to send me examples. Well, hold on. Here's an example. Oh my God, we forgot this, Filippo. Fascism uses Dante.
Well, of course, yeah.
Yeah, fascism uses Dante now, not specifically for slavery in the American sense, but yeah. So I'm embarrassed that it.
Just to justify, the superiority of the race and
Yeah.
imperialism.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So there are very many interesting questions, and I'm sorry if we won't be able to. I'm kind of trying to pick in order, kind of related to your presentation, but just a follow up on the last examples that you were making. Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills. Do the quotes on the bronze plaques above the school doors represent the imposal of Western education onto African Americans who were forcibly brought to the United States? Is the resulting civilization of students who graduate from a colonialism-based education supposed to be an allusion to the hellish experiences one endures while traveling through Dante's Inferno?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's tell that questioner to let's connect and talk about it. And she wrote this novel in the 1980s, and it's a different moment now. And she's not here anymore, which is sad for me. There are archives of Gloria Naylor's work that are currently at Lehigh University. She left her archives to a small Catholic school in Connecticut, and I'm sad that I can't remember the exact name of it, but they have now shared those for a bit with Lehigh University, where a really wonderful team of faculty and students out of the English department are digitizing a lot of it. And it is, I am told that there is a lot one can learn from looking at what she was thinking about when she wrote her novels, and what she was thinking about in particular when she wrote, what she was reading and thinking about when she wrote Linden Hills. And so I would want to look more carefully at that in order to answer this question. I think she's proposing a kind of, I don't want to say middle passage, but a kind of midway that combines, she's not rejecting a vernacular kind of learning. The hero in the novel is Willie, and I didn't tell you enough about them. I shall reduce a really, I think, stunning novel to one paragraph, which is embarrassing. Willie drops out of high school. You heard the sentence where he says to Lester, I would have been all right if I'd gone to school. My mom says I could do it. I have a really good brain. I have good memory. I've got a lot of poems memorized. And he then starts talking about some of the poetry that he knows in the extension of that passage. Lester goes to college. Lester's family is headed in a different direction from Willie's family. And Lester is possibly going to make it up into Linden Hills as someone who lives there. And Willie is in a different direction, but Willie is the one that Gloria Naylor's novel has most faith in, I think. But what's important, I think, is that the two are friends and they stay together. And so I think in answer to the question, what's important is that the text of Dante is there. She rewrites it how she wants it to be. And she has that wonderful graffitied view of graffiti on top of the text. And she doesn't say, or the narrator doesn't say, look how terrible that is, or just comments on it. They have to live side by side. And so I think it is a way to think, how can we take this European stuff? The Great Books course that she took at Brooklyn College had Dante in it in that translation. How can I take that and somehow make that meaningful to my life as Gloria Naylor, who spent 7 years as a Jehovah's Witness out on the streets in Brooklyn? So that is what interests me about what she's doing. And I want to say, in defense of Ralph Ellison, who gets beaten up sometimes for being too European, I think Ralph Ellison is doing something similar. He may not be as bold as she is, but I think he's trying to vernacularize Dante for his readers, for himself. And so how can you take this European classic and make it speak to your cultural moment? And so I back to the question about education, and that's an important question. And I think I've been told that there are various important sociological works or works by sociologists that Gloria Naylor was reading in preparation for writing Linden Hills, and that would be worth digging into to find out more about that. But it's intriguing to think about the whole process of education in regards to that question. And here's the bigger question: what does it mean? What does it mean to be educated? And I think her answer, my interpretation of her answer from reading the novel is Lester is educated. He graduates from high school. He's going to go to college. Willie is educated in a different way. And Willie's education is a very good one for him, and it works.
Okay, let's follow up on education, and let's see if we can. There are 3 questions that I really would love to squeeze in, but let's see what we can do. So the first one is from Carla Frecciera and really connects with the question of education. Thank you, Dennis. This was a wonderful argument for a liberationist Dante. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about Dante's having been taken up in the US canon culture wars in the 1980s. I vividly remember the notorious Dartmouth Review championing Dante as against the various challenges to the canon. And back then, it was texts by African-American men and women that posed this challenge to the canon. In other words, Dante in the 80s in the US was being enlisted for traditionalists in the culture wars. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thank you very much, Carla. I think that they're getting their comeuppance, or that interpretation is getting its comeuppance now, or I wish Amiri Baraka would have said something then, or Gloria Naylor too, for that matter, because they could have, but they're just not in conversation with that kind of august adaptation of Dante or appropriation of Dante. A more detailed study could look at Dante's studies, and it would begin with Lowell and not Robert Lowell, his ancestors, and Longfellow and the hyper-Harvard educated white abolitionists inclined, all doing social good, all that stuff. Readings and adaptations, appropriations of Dante back then in 1880s, the founders of the MLA, for that matter. Grandjean is one of the early presidents, of the Modern Language Association. All that stuff at the beginning that is working hard to canonize a kind of Dante. But just actually, now that I say 1880s and think about those guys, they were all guys. The Modern Language Association itself was rebelling against or pushing against the American Philological Association of Greek and Latin, trying to make a case for the value of doing non-classical languages as seriously as one did classical languages. So there's an element of kind of canonical pushback when they bring Dante in the first place. And one could think about that in the 1880s. But yeah, jumping forward to the 1980s, I think I don't want to say it's funny, but it's the way history goes that we can now look back and say the fuller picture is that there was this other way of appropriating using Dante, and it's establishing a new kind of canon. If that's okay to say, it's establishing a new way to think about Dante that you don't think is canonical because you don't like the way Amiri Baraka sounds. Amiri Baraka, in parentheses, is hard to read for me. That's a personal statement. Ralph Ellison, much less so. And as I said, Gloria Naylor writes, I think, a perfect novel. I think it's a masterful novel. But my difficulty with Amiri Baraka is actually how that book, Freedom Readers, began. It started with Amiri Baraka. And I wrestled with him and grappled with him. And it's the longest part of the book. I'm not sure that that's something to brag about. And that may be less good about the book. But there's a lot of stuff in there about Amiri Baraka. I grappled with him. He was the angel I wrestled, if I could say that.
Yeah, following up on classicism, Susan Gilman asks, your suggestive survey from color to black to African-American Dantes, plural, makes me think of all the work on Black classicism by Martin Bernal, Emily Greenwood, and others. Two questions. How, if at all, is Dante a part of that world? And how do you think Black classicism might shape your work?
Good question. Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can answer. I know that there have been specific studies. There's a Black Ulysses, for example, different interpretations that look at certain classical characters in ways that would be interesting for me to know more about. And so to see how classicism, how Black classicism does things parallel to, analogous to, or different from what Dante does. I don't know enough about that, and I'm forgetting the name of the author who did the book on Black Ulysses. But I wouldn't be against studying that in more detail. At a certain point, you're on a project and you just need to decide to stop or to do it forever. And I decided to stop on this one. And then I decided to pick it back up because I kept finding other things that I alluded to earlier, Robert Penn Warren and Alan Tate and John Crowe Ransom, that intrigued me, and now maybe Verena Davis and Augusta Evans, that might dovetail or bookend in some helpful ways with what I did before. But I'll thank you, Susan. I'm going to meditate on Black classicisms and think about giving you a better answer at a certain point.
I want to ask you this question because I think it's something that comes up a lot in your book, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to address this. Charlie Golden asks, was Dante versus other classics more widely accepted because it was originally written for the people? So, the vernacular. And you also talk about hybridity in your book, that it's really interesting concept that kind of dovetail with post-colonialism. And I was wondering if you want to take the opportunity to say something more about it.
I think back to Carla's question, I think most people in my lifetime have said Dante is a classic. Italians, so Filippo, you can correct me. I'm talking about Americans. You read Dante in great books courses. We Americans read Dante in great books courses, and Gloria Naylor's experience at Brooklyn College is canonical or typical or classical. It's the way many people do. So that's a starting place. I don't think we think of Dante as being necessarily vernacular. We think he's been canonized, and it goes back to Longfellow and then T.S. Eliot. And but having said that, I assume Robert Penn Warren read Dante in college. I don't think he ever talks about that, but he learned Dante on 2-hour lunch breaks when he was at LSU as a professor of English. And he met regularly with Robert Lowell, the poet, and they sat there and just read Dante back and forth to each other. And then Robert Penn Warren, who some people would say is the greatest Southern writer after Faulkner or alongside Faulkner, Robert Penn Warren is doing that at the end of his life with his family. And so his engagement with Dante is not through a great books class, it's just reading the text. And that is, just want to put that out there. It's not all canonical Dante, it's Dante a poet. And that experience of Dante is a poet's way to grapple with Dante. And there's a lot of that in the reception of Dante, how great poets, Seamus Heaney's another one, Lorna Goodison, who's a poet laureate of Jamaica, translates Dante into patois, right? So many poets have this wonderful kind of experience with Dante that goes beyond the great books class. So in a sense, that's another way to think about that. Hybridity, yeah, Dante's text is hybrid, and it's a comedy. That the fact that it's called a comedy, he calls it the commedia. He uses that word twice to describe the text, is in part emblematic of its hybrid status or its mixed status. It is a poem about going up and having this vision at the end, the most august vision imaginable of, we can talk about that in another talk. But at the same time, the devil cuts a fart in the same poem, so you can talk about going from low to high, del suo cul fece trombetta. And it's a kind of vernacular way of saying the devil did that, he made a trumpet out of his ass. And then, so that's funny, I guess, if you like those kinds of jokes, end of Canto 21, Inferno. But you turn the page to Canto 22, and it's hilarious because he's, and you just go do it and read the next 12 lines and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's funny. So a comedic poem can include different registers, stylistic registers, very low, the devil, very high, God. There's a great line in Inferno 34 where Dante says, it's not supposed to be funny, but it is kind of funny to me. He says, if he's looking at the devil, and it's actually, you can imagine if you have in your mind's eye, one of the stills from the slides I showed from the Dante film that gets cut in, spliced into the African-American film Go Down Death. Dante and Virgil are on the ice. They see the devil's gigantic. He's ugly. He's got 3 heads. He's chewing on 3 bodies. And so one can go into detail about that, but Dante says, if he was as good looking then, before he fell from heaven, as he is ugly now, that's pretty impressive, So, I don't know. I hear that with a Tennessee accent. It sounds funny to me. I don't know if he means it as a joke, but there's space in the Divine Comedy for humor, and it comes through at times. Another great one, just one more joke.
I think we have to wrap it up though. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Virgil wants to get Dante to pass through the purgatorial fire, and he says, I think I see the eyes of Beatrice over there. Just teasing it. There's a lot of teasing in there. So, okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I like to, there were other questions that were really compelling, but I like to close on this hint that perhaps, what all your work show is that African American readers really picked on a very important element of the comedy that instead, our modern Western reception has always marginalized, which is that the comedy is a subversive text.
Yeah. It's
a text that through exactly the examples that you were making, through a good laugh, but also through satire and comicity, present resilience in a way that is also meant to subvert the hierarchy of the established hierarchy. So thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you all for being here tonight. And I invite you to join us for the next event, which will be on Tuesday, February the 22nd, same time. The link for registering is already online. And Carla Mallet, professor of Italian and Mediterranean Studies at Michigan, will be our guest to talk together with Sharon Kinoshita about Dante's Mediterranean awakening. So we will explore how Dante, himself was a discoverer of these marginalities at his time. So thank you again, and thank you, Dennis, very much.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Have a good night, everybody.